The stars did not move. That was the first thing Commander Yael Draven noticed every single time she sat in the captain's chair of the USS Eternal Resolve. The stars never moved. They just hung there, ancient and cold and impossibly far away, like silver nails hammered into a black ceiling. And every time she looked at them, she felt the same thing she had felt since she was 7 years old, standing barefoot in her grandmother's backyard in rural Kansas, staring up at the night sky with a flashlight in one hand and a dog-eared astronomy book in the other. She felt hunger. Not the kind of hunger that sent you to the kitchen at 2 in the morning. Not the kind that made your stomach growl. This was a deeper hunger, the kind that lived behind your ribs and never fully went away, no matter how many light years you traveled, no matter how many new worlds you catalogued, no matter how many alien suns you watched rise over alien horizons. It was the hunger of a species that had always looked up and asked why, and then one day finally figured out how to go find out. Yael was 38 years old. She had brown skin, short-cropped black hair, and eyes so dark they looked like 2 pieces of space themselves. She was 5 feet 6 inches tall, lean and precise in her movements, the kind of person who never wasted a step or a word. She had grown up in Dodge City, Kansas, the daughter of a mechanic father and a schoolteacher mother, and she had put herself through the United Earth Naval Academy on a combination of scholarships, stubbornness, and an almost frightening ability to solve complex problems under pressure. She had commanded 3 ships before the Eternal Resolve. A patrol cutter, a science vessel, a mid-range destroyer. Each one had been bigger and more powerful than the last, and each one had taken her farther from Earth than she had ever been before. But the Eternal Resolve was different. The Eternal Resolve was something else entirely. She was a Titan-class warship, the first of her kind. 840 meters from bow to stern. 12 primary railgun batteries, each one capable of firing a depleted uranium slug at 40% the speed of light. 48 secondary plasma turrets arranged in overlapping defensive arcs. 16 torpedo tubes, loaded with a mix of nuclear-tipped kinetics and the newer antimatter warheads that the engineers at Luna Base had spent 11 years developing. 2 fighter bays, each housing 60 Valkyrie-class interceptors. A crew of 4,212 human beings, drawn from every nation on Earth, speaking 47 different languages between them, unified by a single mission patch sewn onto the left shoulder of their black uniforms. A blue marble wrapped in a laurel wreath, with the words United Earth Naval Command stitched beneath it in gold. She was, by any reasonable measure, the most dangerous thing humanity had ever built. And she was, by the standards of the Galactic Sovereignty, the vast, ancient coalition of alien civilizations that controlled the majority of the Milky Way, a complete and total joke. Yael knew this. Her crew knew this. Every human being who had any knowledge of the wider galaxy knew this. The Galactic Sovereignty had been around for 6,000 years. They had member species who had achieved faster-than-light travel before the first human being had ever picked up a stone and thought about throwing it. Their smallest patrol vessels dwarfed the Eternal Resolve. Their weapons technology was generations beyond anything Earth had produced. Their shields, their sensors, their drive systems, all of it was so far advanced that comparing humanity's best efforts to the Sovereignty standard equipment was like comparing a child's paper airplane to a supersonic jet fighter. And yet here was the Eternal Resolve, 340 light-years from Earth, holding position at the edge of the Vareth Corridor, a navigational choke point between 2 star systems that the Sovereignty had flagged as a neutral zone. Here was Yael Draven, sitting in her captain's chair, drinking terrible coffee from a steel mug, watching the stars and waiting. Because humanity, for all its technological youth, had one thing that the Sovereignty had never quite managed to account for. Humanity was stubborn. "Commander," said Lieutenant Marcus Webb from the sensor station, his voice carrying the particular carefully controlled calm that meant something was happening that he wasn't sure how to classify. Marcus was 26, built like a defensive linebacker, with a shaved head and a gap between his front teeth that he'd had since a bar fight in Auckland 3 years ago and refused to have fixed because he said it gave him character. He was the best sensor operator Yael had ever worked with. "I'm picking up a contact. Multiple contacts, actually. Coming out of the Vareth Corridor." Yael set her coffee mug down on the armrest without spilling a drop. "How many?" 17, Marcus said. Then, correction. 22. "They're coming out fast, Commander. Too fast for their size. Classification. Running them through the registry now." Pause. The bridge was quiet, 12 crew members at their stations, all of them pretending to focus on their own consoles while actually listening to every word being spoken between their commander and their sensor chief. "Their Sovereignty vessels, Commander. I'm reading 8 Veth-class patrol cruisers, 6 Dominion-class frigates, 4 Karath-class destroyers and, Marcus stopped. And what, Lieutenant? And 4 Sovereign-class battle cruisers, Commander. The bridge went very still. Yael picked her coffee mug back up. Took a slow sip. Set it back down. 22 Sovereignty vessels, she said. Including 4 Sovereign-class battle cruisers. Coming out of the Vareth corridor. Headed in our direction. Yes, Commander. Are they hailing us? Not yet. Are they targeting us? Marcus checked. Their weapons are not yet fully armed, but their targeting arrays are sweeping our position. Standard threat posture. Yael leaned back in her chair and looked at the main view screen, where 22 blips of light had appeared against the star field, moving in perfect formation with the kind of parade ground precision that only came from 10,000 years of continuous military tradition. 22 Sovereignty vessels. Against 1 human warship. She thought about her grandmother's backyard in Kansas. She thought about the flashlight in the astronomy book. She thought about a 7-year-old girl staring up at stars she didn't yet have names for, feeling that hunger behind her ribs. All stations, she said, her voice calm and level and carrying to every corner of the bridge. General quarters. Not battle stations, general quarters. Let's be alert but not aggressive. Helm, hold our position. Communications, open a channel on Sovereignty standard frequency. She paused. And someone please bring me a fresh cup of coffee. This one's gone cold. There was a beat of silence. Then, from somewhere near the back of the bridge, someone let out a very small, very nervous laugh. And just like that, the tension broke. Not completely, not by a long shot, but enough. Enough to breathe. Enough to work. That was the thing about Yael Draven. She knew exactly how much humanity could endure. And she knew, with bone-deep certainty, that it was considerably more than anyone in the Galactic Sovereignty had ever bothered to calculate. 3 decks below the bridge, in the ship's main engineering bay, Chief Engineer Rosa Ortega was already running diagnostics. Rosa was 44 years old, originally from Guadalajara, Mexico, and she had been fixing things since she could walk. Her father had been an engineer. Her mother had been an engineer. Her older brother was an engineer. Engineering was not something Rosa had chosen. It was something she had been born into the way other people were born into languages or religions, and she had spent her entire life becoming the best at it that any human being had ever been. She was short, 5'2" on a good day, with thick dark hair she kept braided back from her face, ink-stained fingers that never seemed to be fully clean regardless of how much she washed them, and a mind that worked in 3 dimensions simultaneously and never ever stopped. The Eternal Resolve was, in Rosa's professional opinion, a masterpiece. Not because it was the most advanced ship in the known galaxy, it wasn't, not even close. The Sovereignty's vessels made the Eternal Resolve look like a hand-carved canoe next to a container ship. But the Eternal Resolve was a masterpiece because of what it was for what humanity had. It was the absolute ceiling of human engineering capability, the end result of every lesson learned from every mistake made in every ship ever built in the history of the United Earth Naval Command. It was built to be maintained. It was built to be repaired. It was built to take damage and keep functioning. It was built, in other words, the way humans built things, with the expectation that things would go wrong, and with solutions already in place for when they did. When the general quarters alarm sounded, Rosa didn't look up from her console. She had already heard Marcus's report through the ship's internal comm system, because Rosa had rigged every station in engineering to feed into the bridge audio, which was technically against regulations and which Commander Draven had never once commented on because they both understood that a chief engineer who knew what was happening on the bridge before the bridge called her was a chief engineer who could prevent problems before they became catastrophes. Kaito, she said to her senior systems technician, a compact, precise man of Japanese descent named Kaito Mori who had been with her since the Proxima patrol tours. I want full power to the shield emitters. Not combat charge, just topped off. And run a quiet cycle on the railgun capacitors. Don't arm them. Just make sure they're warm. Kaito didn't ask why. That was one of the things Rosa loved about him. On it, Chief. Dara, she said to her second tech, Dara Okonkwo, a tall Nigerian woman with reading glasses perpetually perched on top of her head. I want the emergency power rerouting protocols loaded and standing by. If we take a hit to primary power, I want to be able to reroute to secondaries in under 4 seconds. Already loading them, Chief, Dara said, not looking up from her screen. Rosa nodded. Then she looked at the main engineering display, a holographic schematic of the Eternal Resolve in 3-dimensional detail, every system represented by a different color, the whole ship mapped out like a luminous body lying on an examination table. She looked at it the way she always looked at it, with love. Not sentimentality. Not romanticism. Just the clean, clear love of a craftsperson for a thing they understood completely. "Hold together, old girl," she said quietly to the ship and to no one else. "We might be about to have a busy day." In Fighter Bay Alpha, on the starboard side of the Eternal Resolve, Lieutenant Commander James "Jimmy" Calloway was sitting in the cockpit of his Valkyrie interceptor with his helmet in his lap and a protein bar in his hand, reading a novel on his datapad. Jimmy was 32 years old, from Austin, Texas, with sandy brown hair, a permanent sunburn across his nose and cheeks from too many hours spent on the flight decks of too many ships, and the kind of easy confidence that came from being, by objective measurement and the consensus opinion of everyone who had ever watched him fly, the best pilot in the United Earth Naval Command. He had 114 confirmed kills in simulated combat and 47 in actual engagements, none of them against sovereignty vessels, all of them against the various pirate coalitions and rogue factions that operated in the frontier systems beyond Earth's primary sphere of influence. He had been shot down twice, crash-landed 4 times, and ejected from a disintegrating fighter at approximately 3 times the speed of sound on one memorable occasion that he didn't particularly enjoy talking about. He had survived all of these things, and each time he had survived them he had walked, or limped, or crawled, back to whatever served as a flight deck, climbed into another cockpit, and done it again. He was, in the assessment of every commander he had ever served under, exactly the kind of person you wanted in a fighter bay when things went bad. And exactly the kind of person who made you nervous when things were going fine, because Jimmy Calloway genuinely did not know how to be bored without finding some way to make it interesting. The general quarters alarm cut through the bay like a knife. Jimmy put down his datapad, took one last bite of his protein bar and pulled his helmet on. Around him, 60 pilots were doing the same thing, climbing into cockpits, running through pre-flight sequences, strapping themselves into the quick-launch cradles that would hold them ready until the bay doors opened. The noise in the bay was enormous, the roar of 60 interceptor engines spooling up to standby power, the shout of deck crew running pre-flight checks, the clank of magnetic boots on metal decking. Jimmy keyed his comm, "Alpha Wing, this is Calloway. Sound off." 60 voices came back to him in rapid succession, each one sharp and clear. 60 human beings, ranging in age from 20 to 41 from 12 different countries, each one strapped into a machine built for violence, each one ready. "Alpha Wing is green," Jimmy reported to the bridge. "Awaiting your order, Commander." Through his cockpit's external camera feed, he could see the viewscreen images being relayed to all stations, 22 sovereignty vessels holding formation outside the Varith corridor. He studied them with a pilot's eye, automatically calculating angles and vectors and engagement windows the way other people calculated restaurant bills. 22 to 1. He finished chewing his protein bar. "Well," he said to no one in particular, "this ought to be interesting." On the bridge, the comm channel opened. The voice that came through was translated by the Eternal Resolve's Universal Translation Matrix, one of the few pieces of genuinely advanced technology humanity had managed to acquire through legitimate trade with a sovereignty member species called the Veth. The Veth were a small, gray-skinned, 6-limbed species who served primarily as traders and diplomats in the sovereignty hierarchy, and they had sold humanity the translation matrix 6 years ago because the Veth were, above all things, pragmatic, and they had looked at the determined, industrious, rapidly expanding species from the third planet of a yellow sun and concluded that it was better to be their friends and trading partners than their enemies. The Veth, as it would turn out, were correct. The voice that came through the translation matrix was deep and resonant and carried the particular cadence of a being accustomed to giving orders and having them obeyed without question. "Unidentified vessel. You are operating in a sovereignty-designated neutral zone without authorization. Identify yourself and state your purpose immediately, or you will be considered a hostile presence and treated accordingly." Yael looked at the main view screen. She looked at the 22 blips of light. She looked at her coffee mug. She picked it up, found it still warm enough. Whoever had brought her a fresh cup had done so quietly and efficiently while she was focused on the sensor readings, and took a slow sip. Then she leaned forward slightly in her chair. "This is Commander Yael Draven of the United Earth Naval Command, commanding the warship USS Eternal Resolve," she said, her voice completely level. "We are operating in this sector under the authorization of Treaty Article 7 of the Earth Sovereignty Provisional Accord, which designates this corridor as open to free passage for vessels of all registered species. We are conducting routine patrol operations. We mean no threat to sovereignty vessels or interests." She paused just a half-second. "And to whom am I speaking?" There was a pause on the other end. It was a very specific kind of pause, the kind that happened when someone had expected a very different response and was recalibrating. Then, I am Fleet Admiral Voss Kareth of the Sovereignty Combined Fleet, commanding the 3rd Patrol Armada. Commander. The last word was spoken with a particular emphasis that made clear the speaker considered the difference between a fleet admiral and a commander to be approximately the same as the difference between a mountain and a pebble. The treaty article you cite is under review. Pending that review, this corridor is under temporary sovereignty jurisdiction. You will power down your weapons systems, reduce to minimal propulsion, and hold your position for inspection. Yael's eyes went to Marcus at the sensor station. He met her gaze and gave a very small shake of his head. She read it perfectly. There is no treaty review. He's making that up. She looked back at the view screen. Admiral Kareth, she said, with respect, I'm not aware of any active treaty review affecting Article 7. Could you provide the reference number for that review? Our records would need to confirm before we could comply with any modification to our operational parameters. Another pause. Longer this time. Then, your records are irrelevant. The sovereignty's determinations are not subject to verification by primitive species. You will comply immediately. And there it was. Primitive species. Yael had heard it before. Every human being who dealt with the sovereignty heard it eventually. It wasn't even said with particular malice most of the time. It was said the way you might say short to someone who was short, as a simple statement of observed fact, without cruelty but without any particular care for how it landed either. Humanity was primitive. The sovereignty was advanced. These were, from the sovereignty's perspective, simply the facts of the matter. Humans had been in space for less than 200 years. The sovereignty had members who had been in space for 6,000. The gap was real. The gap was enormous. The sovereignty did not think of humanity as a threat. They didn't even think of humanity as a serious political entity. They thought of humanity the way a particularly patient adult might think of a child who had wandered into the wrong room at a party, with a mixture of mild amusement, mild irritation, and the absolute certainty that the child would eventually be redirected without any significant effort. This was the sovereignty's fundamental mistake. Not because humanity wasn't primitive by the sovereignty's standards. This was a measurable, demonstrable fact. But the sovereignty had made the error of assuming that primitive meant predictable. That it meant manageable. That it meant safe to dismiss. It did not. Admiral Kareth, Yael said, and her voice had not changed by a single degree in temperature or tone, the Eternal Resolve will maintain its current position and operational status. We are not a threat to you or your vessels. We are exercising our treaty rights. If the sovereignty wishes to formally contest those rights, we are happy to submit the matter to the joint arbitration panel specified in Article 19 of the Provisional Accord. She paused. In the meantime, we're just going to stay right here and enjoy the view. It's a lovely part of space. Have you ever noticed the way the Varith Nebula catches the light from the binary pair at Varith Prime? Remarkable colors. The silence that followed was the longest yet. On the bridge of the Eternal Resolve, no one moved. 12 human beings sat at their stations and breathed very carefully and tried not to think too hard about the 22 warships on the other side of that silence. Then Admiral Kareth said something that the translation matrix rendered as, "Hold position. We are consulting." The channel went to standby. Yael leaned back in her chair. "Well," said Lieutenant Marcus Webb from the sensor station very quietly, "that went better than I expected." "It's not over yet," Yael said. "Not by a long shot." She was right. It was not over yet. Aboard the flagship of the 3rd Patrol Armada, the Sovereign Eternal, a Sovereign-class battlecruiser that was, by any objective measurement, one of the most powerful warships in the known galaxy, Fleet Admiral Voss Kareth was doing something he had not done in quite some time. He was uncertain. Voss Kareth was a Karathi, one of the dominant species of the Galactic Sovereignty, and the species that had, for the last 3,000 years, provided the majority of the sovereignty's military leadership. The Karathi were large by galactic standards. Bipedal, standing between 7 and 8 feet tall, covered in a natural body armor of interlocking scale-like plates that ranged in color from deep charcoal to burnished bronze, with 4 eyes arranged in a horizontal band across their broad faces and hands that ended in retractable curved talons. They were physically powerful, intellectually formidable, and culturally oriented around concepts of hierarchy, protocol, and the absolute primacy of established order. Voss himself was 612 years old, young by Karathi standards, but experienced enough to have commanded fleets in 4 actual conflicts and dozens of containment operations. He was considered one of the more capable officers of his generation, which was why he had been assigned to the 3rd Patrol Armada and given the specific and seemingly straightforward task of discouraging human vessels from using the Varith corridor. The Varith corridor was strategically important. It connected two star systems that the Sovereignty was developing for resource extraction, and the Sovereignty did not want primitive species, any primitive species, not just humans, wandering through the area while that development was ongoing. The treaty article the human commander had cited was technically valid, but it was also the kind of technicality that the Sovereignty typically resolved through simple overwhelming force rather than legal argument. Show up with 22 warships. Demand compliance. Receive compliance. Move on. Simple. Clean. Efficient. Except the human commander had not complied. She had argued. She had cited treaty articles. She had asked for reference numbers. And then, most bewilderingly, she had made an observation about nebula colors. Voss was standing at the strategic display table in the center of his flagship's command center, 4 of his senior officers arranged around him, all of them studying the tactical readout of the single human warship holding position less than 40,000 kilometers away. Analysis of the human vessel, he said. Complete analysis. Everything we have. His intelligence officer, a younger Karathi named Drev, pulled up the file. The vessel is designated USS Eternal Resolve Titan class. It is the first of its class, recently commissioned approximately 14 months ago. It is the largest warship the humans have constructed to date. Drev paused. Which is to say, by our standards, it is approximately equivalent to a mid-range patrol frigate. Weapons. Railgun systems, plasma turrets, and torpedo launchers. All of human manufacture. The railgun projectiles are inert kinetics. No guidance systems. The plasma weapons are effective at short range but lack the penetration to cause meaningful damage to our shielding. The torpedoes are, Drev hesitated. The torpedoes are a concern, Admiral. The humans have developed antimatter warheads. Our intelligence indicates they are functional. The yield would be. Would they penetrate Sovereignty shielding? Drev consulted his data. On a direct hit to an unshielded section of a Veth-class patrol cruiser, possibly. Against a Sovereign-class battlecruiser, no. Our shields would contain the detonation without meaningful damage. Voss studied the display. The Eternal Resolve was small. Visually, on the tactical readout, it looked almost fragile next to the mass indicators for his own vessels. 840 meters. The Sovereign Eternal was 6,000 meters from bow to stern. The math was not complicated. The commander, he said. What do we know about her? Commander Yael Draven. Human female, age 38. Born in a settlement called Dodge City in the North American continent. Educated at the United Earth Naval Academy. 3 prior commands. Decorated multiple times. The specifics of human military decorations are not entirely clear in our files, but the quantity suggests significant recognized achievement. Drev paused again. She has a reputation, Admiral. Our intelligence sources among the Veth suggest she is considered unusual even among humans. Unusual how? The Veth describe her as someone who never does what you expect her to do. Who solves problems in ways that other people don't anticipate. Another pause. They also note that she has a particular quality that the Veth find both admirable and unsettling. They describe it as the ability to be completely calm when she should be afraid. Voss looked at the tactical display. 22 Sovereignty vessels. 1 human warship. And on that human warship, a commander who had responded to his ultimatum by asking for bureaucratic reference numbers and commenting on the aesthetic quality of a nearby nebula. Options, he said. We could open fire, said his tactical officer, Commander Breath. At this range, against a single vessel of that size, it would take us approximately. We will not open fire on a registered vessel in a neutral zone without provocation, Voss said flatly. Not because he was particularly concerned about the human ship. His fleet could reduce it to debris in under 2 minutes and they both knew it. But because opening fire without a legally defensible trigger would create a diplomatic incident that would occupy the Sovereignty's legal apparatus for the next decade. The humans were primitive, yes. But they were persistent and they had learned, with unsettling speed, exactly how to use the Sovereignty's own bureaucratic systems against it. What else? We could close to minimum safe distance. Create a physical pressure. Force them to maneuver away from the corridor. Voss considered this. And if they don't maneuver away? Breath's 4 eyes blinked in the pattern that indicated discomfort with a scenario. Then we would be in a standoff of physical proximity with a vessel that, while inferior in every weapons category, has antimatter warheads. At minimum safe distance, a direct detonation from an antimatter warhead against an unshielded section of even the Sovereign Eternal could cause damage, Voss finished. Significant damage, Admiral. Possibly casualties. The command center was quiet for a moment. Voss looked at the tactical display. He looked at the single human ship. He thought about the voice that had come through the communication channel, calm, precise, utterly unimpressed. He thought about the absurd reference number request. He thought about the nebula colors. He was a military commander with 6 centuries of experience. He had faced enemies of genuine power and capability and emerged victorious. He had never, in 600 years, been uncertain about a tactical situation. He was uncertain now. Not because he feared the eternal resolve. The math was still completely clear. 22 against 1. He could destroy that ship. But something about the commander's calm, the specific quality of it, the complete absence of the fear that should have been there, made him wonder whether he was seeing the whole picture. Was she calm because she was brave? Or was she calm because she knew something he didn't? Hold position, he said. Give me a full sensor sweep of that vessel. I want to know everything: power output, shield status, weapons charge, every emission signature, every active system. I want to know what that ship is doing. Admiral, said Drev, a full active sensor sweep at this range would be detectable. The humans would know we were scanning them. Let them know, Voss said. Let's see how they respond. On the bridge of the Eternal Resolve, Marcus Webb sat up slightly straighter. Commander. The Sovereignty fleet is conducting a full active sensor sweep. They're scanning everything: weapons, shields, power output, all of it. Yael nodded, unsurprised. Let them scan. Should I sweep them back? Yael thought about this for exactly 2 seconds. Yes. Full active sweep. Mirror their intensity. Make sure they know we're doing it. Marcus's eyebrows went up, not in objection, but in the particular expression he wore when Commander Draven did something he hadn't anticipated but immediately recognized as brilliant. Yes, Commander. The Eternal Resolve sensor array lit up like a lighthouse. The message was simple and required no translation. You want to look at me? Fine. I'm looking at you too. And I'm not the slightest bit worried about what you'll find. In the briefing room adjacent to the bridge, while the sensor exchange was ongoing, Yael had called together her 4 senior officers for a quick tactical review. They sat around the small table: Marcus Webb from Sensors, Chief Engineer Rosa Ortega via holographic link from Engineering, Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Calloway from the Fighter Bay, and Dr. Lena Shah, the ship's Chief Diplomatic Officer. Lena was 51, originally from Mumbai, with close-cropped silver hair and reading glasses that she perpetually forgot on top of her head in exactly the same manner as Dara Okonkwo in Engineering, which Yael had always found both amusing and inexplicable. Lena had spent 30 years as a diplomat before joining the UNC, and she had negotiated agreements with 3 different alien species, 2 of which had initial positions of hostility toward humanity. She was the calmest person on the ship, which was saying something given the competition. What are they doing? Yael asked the table. Testing, Lena said immediately. Classic first contact assessment protocol, adapted for a show of force scenario. They want to know if we're bluffing. Are we bluffing? Jimmy asked, with the air of a man who already knew the answer but wanted to hear it out loud. We're not bluffing, Yael said. But we're also not suicidal. 22-1 is not a fight I want to have today. She looked around the table. Here's where we are. They want us out of this corridor. They don't have legal grounds to force us out, not yet. But they have overwhelming force. Our job is to make using that force cost them more than letting us stay. How do we do that? Marcus asked. We make them afraid of us, Yael said simply. Silence around the table. Commander, Rosa said from the holographic display, we are one ship. Against 22. I love the Eternal Resolve. She is a beautiful machine and I will defend her to my last breath, but I am also an engineer and I understand physics. They can destroy us. They can, Yael agreed. But can they do it without getting hurt? Rosa was quiet for a moment. Then slowly the corners of her mouth turned up. Ah, she said. Exactly, Yael said. They can kill us. But if we fight back, if we really fight back in the specific way that humans fight, which is to say messily and with complete willingness to absorb punishment in order to inflict it, they will take damage. They will have casualties. And a sovereignty fleet taking casualties in an engagement with a single human vessel that they technically had no legal right to engage in a neutral zone. She let that sit for a second. That is not a report that Fleet Admiral whoever wants to file with Sovereignty High Command. Lena was nodding slowly. You're betting on their bureaucracy. I'm betting on their dignity, Yael corrected. They are proud. They have status to protect. Coming home with a report that says we destroyed one primitive human warship and lost 3 of our own ships in the process is not a proud story. It's a humiliation. So what's our play? Jimmy asked. Yael looked at each of them in turn. We stay exactly where we are. We follow every protocol, obey every treaty provision, give them absolutely zero legal justification for engagement. We scan them back so they know we're watching. We keep weapons at standby, not armed but ready. And we wait. And if they attack anyway? Marcus asked. Yael's expression did not change. Then we fight with everything we have, we make it as expensive as possible, and we make sure the whole galaxy knows exactly what happened here. She paused. But I don't think they'll attack. Because Admiral Kareth is not afraid of us. He's afraid of what we might mean. We are the first Titan-class vessel they've seen. They don't know our full capabilities. They don't know our limits. And the specific way I'm behaving right now, calm, unafraid, unmoved, is making them wonder if they're missing something. She stood up. Let them wonder. That uncertainty is our weapon. And right now it might be our most powerful one. The Sovereignty's full active sensor sweep of the Eternal Resolve took 11 minutes to complete. The results were delivered to Admiral Voss Kareth by his intelligence officer Drev, who brought them to the command center on a data tablet and placed it in front of the Admiral with an expression that Voss, after 500 years of reading Karathi faces, recognized as I have something to tell you that I am not entirely sure how to tell you. Report, Voss said. Drev laid out the sensor data on the command center's main display. The human vessel's weapons systems are at standby. Not armed. Not targeting us. Their shields are charged to approximately 90% but not configured for combat deployment. They are, by every measurable indicator, not preparing to attack. That matches our assessment, Voss said. Continue. Their power output is consistent with standard patrol operations. Their drive systems are on standby thrust. They have made no attempt to maneuver, close distance, or prepare for retreat. Drev paused. However, there are some aspects of the sensor data that I believe warrant specific attention, Admiral. Go on. Drev highlighted 3 sections of the display. First, their railgun systems. Our initial assessment classified them as primitive kinetic launchers. Inert projectiles, no guidance, limited threat. However, the capacitor readings indicate that their railgun batteries are capable of achieving a muzzle velocity that we had not previously attributed to human kinetic technology. If the sensor data is accurate, they can accelerate their projectiles to approximately 38% the speed of light. Voss stared at the display. That's not possible. Human metallurgy cannot produce railgun barrels capable of. That is what the data indicates, Admiral. We have run the readings 3 times. The result is consistent. Voss was quiet for a moment. A projectile at 38% the speed of light. Against Sovereignty shielding. He ran the calculation in his mind. Their shields were designed to handle energy weapons, beam weapons, guided warheads. Against a kinetic projectile of sufficient mass moving at a significant fraction of light speed, shielding became significantly less effective, not because the shield couldn't absorb the energy, but because the time frame of impact was too brief for the shield emitters to fully respond. It was a known gap in Sovereignty defensive doctrine, one they had never particularly worried about because no species they had encountered operated kinetic weapons at that velocity. Second anomaly, Drev continued. Their antimatter torpedoes. Our initial assessment indicated a yield sufficient to cause damage to lightly shielded vessels. However, the torpedo bay emissions suggest a significantly higher antimatter density than our previous intelligence indicated. The actual yield per torpedo may be, Drev consulted the data, may be substantially higher than our models predicted. How substantially? Drev named a figure. Voss was quiet for a longer moment this time. Admiral, said his tactical officer Breth, his voice carefully controlled, if those torpedo yields are accurate, then in a full engagement at current range, a salvo of 12 to 16 torpedoes detonated against our formation simultaneously would. I can do the math, Voss said. The command center was very quiet. Third anomaly, Drev said, and now his voice had the particular quality of someone delivering information that they genuinely did not fully know how to classify. The human vessel's fighter bays. Our sensors indicate that they are at full readiness. All interceptors are on standby launch protocols. 120 fighters. We knew about the fighters. Their small craft limited? Yes, Admiral. But the emissions from their engines suggest a modification that we don't have in our database. Their drive signatures are inconsistent with standard human Valkyrie-class interceptors. Someone has modified them. The modification appears to relate to, Drev paused, to speed and maneuverability. They modified their fighters? Breth said. For what purpose? Our fighter complements outnumber. For the purpose of being very difficult to hit, Drev said with the patience of someone who had already worked through this. Admiral, I want to be clear that none of these findings individually represents a decisive threat to our fleet. 22 sovereignty vessels against a single human warship remains a mathematical certainty in our favor. However, in combination, faster-than-expected kinetic weapons, higher-than-expected torpedo yields, modified interceptors of unknown performance characteristics. The question is no longer whether we can destroy them. The question is how much we might be damaged in doing so. Vas Kareth stood very still and looked at the display for a long time. He thought about the human commander's voice. Come. Precise. Unafraid. You want to look at me? Fine. I'm looking at you too. She knew we would scan her, he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Admiral? The commander. She knew we would conduct a detailed scan. She knew we would find these anomalies. She allowed the scan without any attempt to mask or suppress the readings. He looked at the display. She wanted us to see this. Silence in the command center. She is showing us her teeth, Voss said, without threatening to bite. She is telling us, I am more dangerous than you thought. Do you still want to do this? Commander Breth spoke carefully. Admiral. She is still one ship. Yes, Voss agreed. She is. And that is precisely what concerns me. He turned away from the display. Because a commander who sits in a vessel against 22 opponents and is calm, not reckless, not desperate, calm, is either a fool or someone who understands something about this situation that we don't. He moved to the main viewport. The Eternal Resolve was visible in the distance as a small shape against the star field. Small, angular, nothing like the flowing curves of sovereignty warships. Human aesthetic sensibilities and engineering tended toward the angular and the utilitarian. Their ships looked like tools rather than art. Like something built by people who were more interested in what it could do than how it looked doing it. She knows our doctrine, Voss said. She knows we won't fire without legal justification. She knows we're calculating the cost of engaging her. And she is betting, very calmly, very deliberately betting, that the cost is higher than we want to pay. He turned back to his officers. What does that tell you about her? Drev was the one who answered, slowly. That she has done this before. Not this specific situation, perhaps. But she has been in situations where the math was against her. And she has found a way through them that did not involve the math. Yes, Voss said. And that is the thing about humans, isn't it? That is the thing our intelligence division has been trying to put into clear language for 60 years and has never quite managed. The math is against them in almost everything. They are young. They are small. They are technologically limited. By any reasonable measurement, they should not be here. They should not be expanding at the rate they are expanding. They should not have built the ship they built. They should not be sitting in a neutral zone telling a sovereignty fleet admiral to produce a reference number. He looked at the tactical display. And yet, back on the Eternal Resolve, Yael was in her command chair, coffee mug in hand, watching the sovereignty fleet's formation on the main view screen. They hadn't moved. 22 ships, holding position less than 40,000 kilometers away. Massive, powerful, ancient. Each one a product of thousands of years of continuous technological development. Each one crewed by beings who had been navigating the stars since before humanity had figured out the wheel. And they weren't moving. Marcus, she said quietly, how are we doing on the sensor sweep data from their fleet? Marcus ran through his analysis. Their shields are at full combat strength. Weapons are armed, not targeting us but armed. I'm reading elevated power output on their main drive systems, which suggests they're ready to maneuver but haven't committed to a direction yet. He paused. An admiral, they're talking. A lot. Heavy encrypted communication traffic between the flagship and the rest of the fleet. They're having a conversation. Good, Yael said. Let them talk. From the comm station, Ensign Torres, 23 sharp from Chicago, looked up. Commander, we have an incoming hail from the Sovereignty flagship. Admiral Kareth again. Put him through. The translation matrix crackled. And then Admiral Kareth's voice came through, and something in the quality of it had changed, barely, almost imperceptibly, but changed nonetheless. There was less certainty in it. Not doubt exactly. More like recalibration. Commander Draven. I have reviewed the sensor data from your vessel. I expected you would, Yael said. Pause. Your railgun velocities are not consistent with our database estimates for human technology. We've been making improvements, Yael said pleasantly. Your torpedo yields are also higher than our projections. We work hard. Another pause longer. Commander. I am going to speak frankly, outside of diplomatic protocol. Yael sat up slightly. This was interesting. Please do, Admiral. I can destroy your vessel, Kareth said. I want you to understand that clearly. The mathematics are not in question. 22 sovereignty vessels against one human warship. There is one possible outcome in a direct engagement, and it is not favorable to your crew. I understand the math, Yael said. Then why? The Admiral stopped. Started again. Why are you not afraid? Yael looked at the view screen. At the 22 blips of light. She thought about Kansas. She thought about the stars that didn't move. She thought about 4,212 human beings on the ship around her, each one a person with a life and a history and a home they missed and a reason for being here. She thought about what humanity had paid in blood and time and effort and failure to get to this exact moment, this one human ship in this one corridor in this one tiny insignificant corner of a vast and ancient galaxy. Because fear doesn't help me think, she said. And right now I need to think very clearly. She paused. Admiral, you said you'd speak frankly. I'll return the favor. You're right that you can destroy us. But I think you've now seen enough of our sensor data to know that doing so is going to cost you something. Maybe not enough to matter strategically, but enough to matter politically. Enough to matter for your report. She let that sit for a second. And I don't think the corridor is worth that cost to you. Not for this. Not for keeping one human patrol vessel out of a transit corridor that we have legal treaty rights to use. Silence on the channel. So here's what I propose, Yael continued. We stay here. We conduct our patrol. We don't interfere with anything your fleet is doing. And in approximately 72 hours, when our patrol rotation is complete, we go home. No incident. No report filed with the Joint Arbitration Panel. No diplomatic noise. Just two military forces exercising their respective rights in a neutral zone, professionally and without hostility. Another pause. What do you say, Admiral? The silence that followed lasted 45 seconds. Yael counted. Then, your patrol rotation is 72 hours? Standard protocol. And after 72 hours, you would withdraw from the Vareth corridor? We'd rotate out and a new patrol would come in approximately a week later, Yael said. Which is also our treaty right. But yes, this specific vessel would withdraw. Another silence, shorter this time. Hold your position, Commander Draven. We are considering your proposal. The channel went to standby again. From the back of the bridge, Ensign Torres let out a very slow, very quiet breath. Marcus Webb looked at his sensor readout. Jimmy Calloway's voice came over the ship-wide comm from Fighter Bay Alpha, low and wondering, Commander, are they actually considering it? They're considering it, Yael said. Because you asked them nicely? Because I gave them a way to leave that doesn't look like retreat, Yael said. Nobody backs down from a fight they think they could win. But everybody takes a graceful off-ramp if it's offered correctly. She picked up her coffee mug. It was cold again. The Sovereignty was considering the proposal. This was, by any reasonable standard, remarkable. Sovereignty fleet admirals did not consider proposals from commanders of single ships belonging to primitive species. They issued directives. They expected compliance. The notion of sitting in a 6,000-meter flagship and genuinely, seriously weighing the words of a junior officer from a species that had been in space for less than 2 centuries was, by the cultural logic of the Karathi military, something close to absurd. And yet Vos Kareth was doing exactly that. He was doing it because he was, despite everything, a competent commander. And competent commanders recognized, even when it was uncomfortable, when a situation was not unfolding the way they had expected. He had called a full staff meeting in the Sovereign Eternal's war room. Every senior officer in his fleet was attending via holographic link, 22 ship captains and their senior staff, floating as luminous images around the central display table where the tactical overview of the Vareth corridor was laid out in 3 dimensions. Opinions, Vos said. They gave him a range of them. Captain Vorin of the Sovereignty battlecruiser Indomitable Will was the most aggressive of his commanders, and predictably so. We should engage. The human vessel is within legal range of a weapons discharge protocol under the Emergency Sovereignty Preservation Act. The ESPA requires documentation of an active hostile act, Vos said. They've done nothing hostile. Their presence in a contested corridor is treaty protected. I've had our legal division review it 3 times. The treaty is valid. The article is valid. If we fire on them without a defensible legal trigger, the Sovereignty Council will spend the next 50 years untangling the diplomatic consequences. Voss looked at Voren steadily. Next. Captain Liara of the frigate Serene Dominion, a Veth, actually one of several Veth commanders embedded in his fleet as a product of the Sovereignty's coalition structure, spoke next in the gentle, considered way of her species. Admiral, I have been studying the human commander's communications pattern. She is following a very deliberate strategy. She is not trying to provoke us. She is not trying to escalate. She is trying to make this situation boring. Boring? Voss repeated. In the specific sense that boring situations do not produce action. If this remains boring, if nothing dramatic happens, if no shots are fired, if she continues to be pleasant and treaty compliant and to express appreciation for the local nebula, then eventually we will need to either fire on her without justification or withdraw. And the longer we hold this position without a resolution, the more visibility this situation attracts. Captain Liara paused. Admiral, this incident is already being observed. The Veth trade network has 3 vessels in sensor range of the corridor. If shots are fired against a compliant vessel, that information will be transmitted to every Sovereignty Council member within 48 hours. Voss had already considered this. The Veth would report an unprovoked attack on a human vessel. The Veth would report exactly what they observed, Liara said, with the careful neutrality of a diplomat. They would simply observe it thoroughly. Voss looked at the tactical display. 1 human ship. 22 Sovereignty vessels. 3 Veth trade ships in sensor range quietly watching. And then his intelligence officer Drev, who had been silent for most of the meeting, raised his hand. Admiral, I need to report something that arrived during our sensor sweep. It was buried in the initial data and I only flagged it now because I ran a comparison against our historical database. Report. Drev looked uncomfortable in a way that was unusual for him. During our full sensor sweep of the Eternal Resolve, we picked up a secondary power reading from their lower decks. It was faint, almost within background noise parameters. But when I compared it to our database of known energy signatures, he paused. It matched a signature type that we have classified as a theoretical construct. Something our own scientists have modeled but not yet built. The war room went quiet. Explain, Voss said. The signature is consistent with a fold space drive precursor, Drev said. Admiral, we believe, and I want to be clear, this is inference from a single faint reading, not confirmed data. We believe the Eternal Resolve may be carrying a prototype fold space drive. Silence. Complete, comprehensive, stunned silence. Fold space drive technology was not something that primitive species had. It was not something that species with less than 1,000 years of spaceflight experience had. Fold space drives, the technology that allowed instantaneous transit across arbitrary distances by folding space itself rather than traversing it, was one of the Sovereignty's most closely held technological achievements, developed over 2,000 years of continuous research and considered to be so far beyond the capability of young species that its existence wasn't even discussed in the context of emerging civilization interactions. That's impossible, Captain Voren said immediately. The reading may have been a false positive, Drev acknowledged. The signal-to-noise ratio was poor. But the signature pattern matched our theoretical models at 93% confidence. 93%, Voss said quietly. Humans don't have fold space technology, Voren said. They barely have functional FTL. Their best drives top out at 20 light-years per day. The gap between that and fold space is enormous, Voss agreed. Yes. And yet here we are. He looked at the tactical display. Drev. If the reading is accurate, if they have a prototype fold space drive, why would they be using it on a patrol vessel? Testing, Drev said. A working prototype would require real space field testing to validate performance data. A patrol mission would provide cover for that testing without drawing attention to it. He paused. Admiral, if this reading is accurate, and if the humans have achieved functional fold space drive technology, then our entire assessment of their developmental timeline needs to be revised. Comprehensively. Voss was very still. He thought about the voice on the communication channel. Come. Precise. Unafraid. Why are you not afraid? Because fear doesn't help me think. And right now, I need to think very clearly. What if she wasn't calm because she was brave? What if she wasn't calm because of the railgun velocities or the torpedo yields? What if she was calm because she knew that even if this engagement went badly, even if the worst happened and 22 Sovereignty vessels opened fire, she had an escape option that he couldn't counter? What if she was calm because she could leave whenever she wanted to? The war room was very quiet. "Admiral," said Captain Liara of the Veth frigate, very carefully, "what would you like to do?" Vas Kareth, Fleet Admiral of the 3rd Patrol Armada, commanding 22 warships with 600 years of military experience behind him, looked at the display showing a single human vessel sitting quietly in a neutral zone, and made a decision that would be discussed in military academies for the next 200 years. "Accept her proposal," he said. "We hold position. We do not engage. We allow her patrol rotation to complete in 72 hours. He paused. "And we file a comprehensive intelligence report with Sovereignty High Command. Full sensor data. All anomalies. The fold space signature reading. And if High Command asks why we did not engage?" Vorin said, with the stiffness of someone who didn't like the answer they saw coming. "We tell them the truth," Voss said. "We tell them that after a full tactical assessment, we determined that the engagement cost did not justify the objective." He looked around the room. "And we tell them that we have very possibly made a fundamental error in our assessment of where humanity currently stands in its technological development." He looked at the display one more time. "Send the communication to Commander Draven. Tell her we accept the proposal. 72 hours. On the bridge of the Eternal Resolve, Yael received the message. She listened to Admiral Karatha's voice tell her that the Sovereignty accepted her proposal, that the Eternal Resolve was free to complete its patrol rotation, and that the 3rd Patrol Armada would maintain its current position without hostile action. When the channel closed, she sat in her chair for a moment. Marcus Webb turned from his sensor station. His expression was somewhere between relief and incredulous joy. "Commander, did we just stare down 22 Sovereignty warships with a single patrol vessel?" "We maintained our treaty rights in a neutral zone," Yael said carefully. "Nothing more." "Commander." Marcus's voice had the delighted exasperation of someone watching a magician refuse to explain the trick. "How did you know they would back down?" Yael was quiet for a moment. She looked at the view screen at the 22 blips of light that hadn't moved. "I didn't know," she said. "I hoped. I calculated. I made the best assessment I could of the situation." She paused. "But I also knew this. If they were the kind of force that fires on a compliant vessel in a neutral zone without justification, then nothing I said was going to stop it, and we were going to have a very different conversation. And if they were the kind of force that operates within their own laws and takes their treaty obligations seriously," she looked at the display, "then they were the kind of force that could be reasoned with." "And the fold space drive?" Marcus asked very quietly. Yael looked at him. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. Marcus held her gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then he turned back to his console. "Right. Of course not. My mistake." Yael looked at the view screen. Down in engineering, Rosa Ortega was already powering down the secondary drive system that had produced the faint, carefully calibrated energy signature that matched, at approximately 93% confidence, the theoretical models for a fold space drive precursor. It was not a fold space drive. It was a very specific power output configuration that Rosa had designed herself over the course of 6 months, after reviewing everything humanity had managed to acquire about Sovereignty fold space technology, and which produced a signature that would read as suggestive without being definitive. It was, in other words, a bluff. A very carefully constructed bluff. Yael picked up her coffee mug. It was cold again. She drank it anyway. Part 5. The report that shook Sovereignty High Command. The intelligence report filed by Admiral Vas Kareth arrived at Sovereignty High Command on the capital world of Karath Prime 14 days after the incident in the Vareth Corridor. It was a comprehensive document, 17,000 words in standard sovereignty notation, accompanied by raw sensor data, communication transcripts, spectral analysis readings, and Drev's detailed breakdown of every anomaly detected during the full active sweep of the Eternal Resolve. It included the railgun velocity data, the torpedo yield estimates, the modified interceptor signatures, and the fold space drive precursor reading, all presented with the careful, qualified language of an intelligence officer who understood the difference between confirmed data and inference. It was flagged at maximum priority. It sat in the inbox of Grand Admiral Sova Reith, the supreme commander of all sovereignty military forces, a Karathi of 900 years' experience who had personally overseen the integration of 14 new species into the Sovereignty Coalition, for approximately 6 hours before she read it. Then she called an emergency meeting of the Joint Military Council. The council met in the Grand Hall of the Sovereignty Citadel on Karath Prime, a room large enough to accommodate 30 beings comfortably, with walls of polished stone that had been old when humanity's ancestor species were still living in trees, and ceiling frescoes depicting 6,000 years of sovereignty military history. 8 council members attended. Grand Admiral Reith sat at the head of the table, with the intelligence report projected on the wall behind her. "I will state the obvious," she said without preamble. "If Admiral Caratha's sensor data is accurate, we have been wrong about humanity." Silence. "I want a technical review panel assembled within 48 hours to analyze the sensor data. I want our top scientists working on the foldspace signature reading specifically. She paused. "I want to know if that reading is possible. Because if it is possible, then everything we thought we understood about the human developmental timeline is incorrect. And if we have been wrong about their timeline, we need to immediately reassess what else we may have been wrong about." Council Member Dressa, the Sovereignty's Chief of Strategic Intelligence, an ancient Karathi of over 1,000 years who had the particular manner of someone who had seen so many crises come and go that she had developed a philosophical relationship with catastrophe, raised a hand. "Grand Admiral, before we convene the technical panel, I want to raise a different point." "Speak." "The sensor reading may be accurate. It may also be a deliberate fabrication." Dressa's 4 eyes moved slowly around the council table. "The human commander in question has a documented reputation for unconventional problem-solving. She was outnumbered 22-1. She needed to deter an engagement she could not win. A carefully staged energy signature that implied capabilities she did not actually have would be an extremely effective way to—" "You're saying it was a bluff," Grand Admiral Reith said. "I'm saying it may have been a bluff. I'm saying we should determine which it was before we restructure our entire intelligence assessment of humanity based on one ambiguous sensor reading from a contested situation." Reith looked at her for a moment. "And if it was a bluff? Then Commander Draven is considerably more dangerous than the ship she commands," Dressa said. "Because a commander who can construct a bluff of that quality, under that pressure, and execute it with sufficient composure to make a fleet admiral back down, that is a quality that does not care what the technology gap is. That is a quality that gets worse for us as humanity's technology improves." The council was quiet. "And if it wasn't a bluff?" Reith asked. "Then the technology gap is already closing," Dressa said. "And we need to decide, as a civilization, what we want our relationship with humanity to be before it closes completely." More silence. The kind of silence that happens when a room full of very old, very powerful beings realizes that the world has shifted under their feet while they weren't looking. "What do we know about this Commander Draven?" Reith asked. "Born in the North American continent of Earth. Age 38. Educated at their primary naval academy. For ship commands. Decorated multiple times." Dressa paused. "Our Veth contacts describe her as, and I'm translating this from the Veth who have a particular way with descriptive language, as a person who fights battles before they start, in the space between words, where other commanders are still deciding whether the battle has begun." Silence. "That is a concerning description," Reith said. "Yes," Dressa agreed. "It is." On Earth, Commander Yael Draven did not know she was being discussed at Sovereignty High Command. She was standing in the parking lot of Dodge City Regional Hospital in Kansas in early evening, with a paper cup of terrible hospital coffee in her hand, watching the sky turn pink and orange above the flat sweep of the plains. She had been summoned home on emergency leave 4 days after the incident in the Verith corridor. Her mother had had a stroke. Margaret Draven was 68 years old, a retired schoolteacher with gray-shot hair and reading glasses that she wore on a chain around her neck and 27 years of lesson plans stored in the filing cabinet in her study. She had taught English literature at Dodge City Middle School for 3 decades. She had read every book in the Dodge City Library at least twice. She had sent her daughter a message on every single one of her daughter's deployments without exception. Sometimes daily, sometimes just a few words, always with a specific and deliberate love that Yael had spent her childhood taking for granted and her adulthood understanding. Margaret had been found by a neighbor on a Tuesday morning, confused and unable to speak clearly, and she had been in surgery within the hour and in recovery for 3 days, and now she was stable, awake, speaking in the careful reconstructed sentences of someone whose brain had taken a hit and was finding its way back. Yael had spent the first day sitting by her mother's bed. The second day she had also spent by her mother's bed. Today, day 3, she was standing in the parking lot with hospital coffee because she needed the sky. She needed to see it. She needed the horizon. "You still look up," said a voice behind her. She turned. Her father, Robert Draven, 69, gray hair, mechanic's hands that would never be fully clean, the kind of quiet steadiness that some people spent their whole lives searching for in other people, was walking across the parking lot toward her with 2 more cups of terrible hospital coffee. "Old habit," she said. He stood beside her and handed her a fresh cup. She took it without putting down the old one. He looked at the sky too, companionably, the way he had always looked at things with her, not steering her attention, just being present in the same direction. "Your mother asked about your ship today," he said. "What did she ask?" "She asked if it was as big as you said it was." He smiled. "I told her I'd never seen it, so I couldn't say. She told me I needed to go see it." He paused. "She's getting her words back." Yael felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized was tight. "Good." They were quiet for a moment. "How did it go?" her father asked. "The mission. The one they wouldn't tell us anything about." "Fine," Yael said. "Fine. We maintained our patrol rotation and withdrew at the end of the scheduled period. No shots fired. No incidents." She paused. "Fine." Her father looked at her with the particular steady patience of a parent who had been watching his child understate things for 31 years. "Aha." She drank her coffee. He drank his. The sky went from orange to purple. "Dad," she said after a while. "Yeah. Do you remember when I was 7 and you showed me how to fix the engine on the old Chevy? The blue one?" "The 97 pickup," he said. "Yeah, I remember. You couldn't reach the top of the engine block. I had to lift you. You told me that the engine wasn't magic. That it was just parts. That if you understood all the parts, you could fix anything." She looked at the sky. "Do you still believe that?" He thought about it. "I believe it about engines," he said. "People are harder. But I think the principle holds. You have to understand what you're dealing with before you can figure out what to do about it." She nodded slowly. "What are you dealing with?" he asked. She was quiet for a long moment. In the distance, a plane was crossing the sky, small and slow-moving compared to the things she was used to, but still, somehow, still the same instinct. The same hunger. The same reaching upward. "Something big," she said. "Bigger than before?" "Much bigger." He nodded. "You'll figure it out." "How do you know?" He looked at her with the steady, uncomplicated certainty that had been one of the primary defining forces of her life. "Because you always do," he said. "And because when you can't figure it out by yourself, you find people who can help you. And because," he paused, "because you've never once, not a single time in your life, let being afraid stop you from thinking clearly." She looked at him. "Not afraid doesn't mean not scared," he said. "It means scared and thinking anyway." She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "I missed this." "The hospital coffee?" he said, and she laughed. Really laughed, the kind that came from somewhere deeper than humor, the kind that was also exhale and release and the physical expression of something softening, and her father smiled at the sky, satisfied. While Yael was on Earth, something was happening in the Vareth corridor that nobody had expected. The Sovereignty's 3rd Patrol Armada had withdrawn from the corridor 14 hours after accepting Yael's proposal. Not immediately, not with obvious haste, but in the measured, organized fashion of a fleet that was exercising its legitimate operational prerogative to redeploy. They had moved deeper into Sovereignty space, toward the Vareth Prime Development Zone, where Admiral Kareth had filed his comprehensive intelligence report and settled into the particular kind of troubled contemplation that afflicted competent commanders when a situation had not gone as they planned. The Eternal Resolve had completed its 72-hour patrol rotation and withdrawn from the corridor. But the corridor was not empty. Lieutenant Commander Daniel Park, 29, Korean-American from Seattle, serving on the science vessel U.S. Franklin, had been conducting deep space spectral mapping of the Vareth corridor for the last 3 months. The Franklin was not a warship. It was a sleek, quiet scientific vessel, significantly smaller than the Eternal Resolve, with minimal weapons, 2 defensive plasma turrets, and a crew of 60. It was, in most conventional senses, completely non-threatening. Daniel had seen the whole thing from 17 light hours away. He had tracked the Sovereignty fleet's arrival, monitored the standoff, and watched the Sovereignty withdraw, all through the Franklin's extremely sensitive long-range sensor array, which was designed for star mapping but functioned exceptionally well for monitoring large groups of warships in a relatively contained area. He had also, in the course of his standard spectral mapping work, found something in the Vareth corridor that had nothing to do with the standoff between humanity and the Sovereignty fleet. Something that changed the context of everything. He filed a report to United Earth Naval Command. The report contained detailed sensor data, spectral analysis results, and a conclusion that Daniel had spent 3 days trying to prove wrong before accepting it as the only interpretation the data supported. The Vareth corridor was not strategically important because of the resource extraction development zones at Vareth Prime. It was strategically important because of what was on the other side of it, in the dark space beyond the mapped boundary of the Sovereignty's territory, and what that thing appeared to be doing. The report was flagged maximum priority. It arrived on the desk of United Earth Naval Command's Admiral General Ruth Vasquez 48 hours after Daniel filed it. Ruth Vasquez was 57, Brazilian-American, from Sao Paulo, with close-cropped gray hair and a manner that reminded everyone who met her of a particularly well-calibrated weapon, precise, patient, and dangerous in direct proportion to how calm she appeared. She had commanded ships for 20 years before moving into strategic command, and she had served as Admiral General of UNC for 6 years, during which time humanity's reach into the galaxy had expanded more rapidly than in the preceding 50 years combined. She read Daniel's report 3 times. Then she made 3 calls. The first call was to Earth's diplomatic mission to the Galactic Sovereignty, Ambassador Chinwei, who had spent 15 years navigating the specific, elaborate, and occasionally maddening complexities of human sovereignty relations. The second call was to the captain of the USS Eternal Resolve, requesting Commander Draven's early return from emergency leave. The third call was to a facility on the lunar surface, a classified facility unmarked on any official document, staffed by 42 people whose work was not acknowledged in any public record, and which had been running continuously and very quietly for the last 9 years. When Yael's comm went off in the hospital corridor, she looked at the identifier and knew immediately that her leave was over. She went back into her mother's room. Margaret Draven was sitting up in bed, small and a little pale but with color in her cheeks and the particular focused expression she wore when she was reading, though she was not reading now. She was watching the door because she had heard the comm go off and she was her daughter's mother and she knew what that expression meant. "You have to go," Margaret said. "Not for a few hours," Yael said. "But yes. Important. Seems like it." Margaret looked at her for a moment. Then she reached out her hand, the left one, the one with better control since the stroke, and Yael took it and sat on the edge of the bed. "Tell me something," Margaret said in the careful reconstructed sentences. "About where you go. Not secret things. Just, what does it look like? Where you go." Yael thought about this. "It looks like Kansas," she said. "From very far away. Dark and flat and huge with lights scattered across it. Except the lights don't move and they never turn off and there are so many of them, Mom. More than you can count. More than anyone has ever counted." She paused. "And in between them there's all this space. This enormous, cold, silent space. And out there in the space there are—" She stopped. Thought of a way to say it that didn't require a security clearance. "There are things we're just beginning to understand. Things that were there long before we arrived and things that are changing. Because we're there now." Margaret looked at her with the clear, wise eyes of a woman who had spent her life teaching other people's children how to read between the lines. "Are you scared?" Yael looked at their joined hands. "Sometimes." "Good," Margaret said. "Scared means you're paying attention." She squeezed her daughter's hand. "Pay attention, Yael. And then come home." Yael squeezed back. "I will." She meant both. The briefing was held on Luna Base, the sprawling, mostly subterranean complex on the far side of Earth's moon that served as the primary command hub of United Earth Naval Command. The main briefing room was built into the bedrock 60 meters below the lunar surface, with artificial gravity and recycled air and walls covered in tactical displays. Yael arrived 11 hours after leaving her mother's hospital room in Dodge City. She still had Kansas in her lungs, the dry, flat smell of planes and the faint medicinal residue of the hospital, and she sat down in the briefing room chair with the slightly unmoored feeling of a person whose emotional context had shifted violently 3 times in less than a week. Also present, Admiral General Vasquez sitting at the head of the table with Daniel Park's report in front of her. Ambassador Chinwei, who had come directly from the Sovereignty diplomatic quarter in Geneva and still had the careful, composed face of a man who had spent 15 years not letting aliens read his emotions. Dr. Priya Nakamura, the head of UNC's Deep Space Intelligence Division, 45 Indian Japanese from Tokyo, with the particular intensity of someone who had been sleeping only 4 hours a night for the last month because the data wouldn't let her rest. And one other person, introduced simply as Director Cole of the Lunar Research Facility, whose work was not named and who did not elaborate. "You've read the preliminary summary," Vasquez said to Yael. "On the transport here," Yael confirmed. "Good. Dr. Nakamura will walk us through the complete analysis." Priya stood up and activated the main display. What Lieutenant Commander Park found during his spectral mapping work in the Vareth corridor is this. She pulled up a 3-dimensional spatial map of the region beyond the corridor's far end. On the other side of the corridor, in what the Sovereignty designates as unmapped buffer space, there are gravitational anomalies. Multiple anomalies, distributed across a region approximately 40 light-years in diameter. Lieutenant Commander Park's first assessment was that these were dense stellar remnants, black holes, neutron stars, creating a complex gravitational web. But that's not what they are, Yael said. No, Priya said. That's not what they are. She zoomed in on one of the anomalies. The mass signature is wrong. Black holes of the size required to produce these readings would have additional effects. Hawking radiation signatures, accretion disk formations, gravitational lensing of background stars. None of those effects are present. The gravitational anomalies are real. The astronomical objects that should be causing them are not there. Silence in the room. They're being produced artificially, Yael said. That's our conclusion. Yes. Priya moved the display. Here is the distribution pattern of the anomalies across the 40 light-year region. Note the spacing. She highlighted the distances between each anomaly. They're not random. The distribution follows a specific geometric pattern. When you map it in 3 dimensions, she rotated the display, and the pattern of anomalies resolved into something that was unmistakably deliberate. It's a network. Some kind of structured array of gravitational generators, arranged in a precise configuration. The room was very quiet. What does the array do? Vasquez asked. We believe it's a large-scale spatial distortion generator, Priya said. Something designed to, and I want to be clear that this is our best current interpretation, not a confirmed conclusion, to create a stable fold in spacetime across a wide area. Not a point-to-point transit like a fold space drive. Something much larger. A fold on a regional scale. Regional scale, Ambassador Chin said, slowly. 40 light-years of distorted space. If the array is fully activated, the gravitational implications within that region would be, Priya paused, would be severe. Transit through the region would become extremely difficult without the specific navigation parameters that whoever built the array would possess. It would effectively create a zone of controlled impassability. Controlled by whoever built the array, Yael said. Yes. Who built it? Vasquez asked. We don't know, Priya said. Our database has nothing matching this technology. The Sovereignty's known technology base doesn't include large-scale spatial distortion arrays of this type. We have no intelligence indicating that any known species is developing this. She paused. Which means we're either looking at a capability that a known species has developed covertly, or an unknown species, Yael finished. Yes. The word landed in the room like a stone into still water. Unknown species. In 6,000 years of sovereignty expansion across the galaxy, the number of species that had been discovered with technology beyond the Sovereignty's capability could be counted on one hand, and most of those encounters had not gone well. Is it active? Vasquez asked. The array is running at partial capacity, Priya said. Somewhere between 20 and 30% of full output, based on the gravitational anomaly readings. At current output levels, the effects within the region are detectable but not dangerous to transit. At full output, she paused. At full output, we don't know exactly what the effects would be. We'd need to model it. But you have a guess, Yael said. Priya looked at her. My best guess is that at full output, the array would render approximately 40 light-years of space around the Vareth corridor effectively impassable without navigation keys that only the array's builders would possess. Which would include, she gestured at the spatial map, the standard route between Sovereignty space and Earth, which runs directly through the Vareth corridor. More silence. Let me understand this correctly, Ambassador Chin said carefully. Someone, unknown, has built a device that, when fully activated, would cut off direct transit between Earth and the Sovereignty. Between Earth and most of inhabited Sovereignty space, yes, Priya said. And the Sovereignty knows this array is here? Priya and Vasquez exchanged a look. The Sovereignty has been operating in the Vareth corridor for 2 years, Vasquez said. Their development zones at Vareth Prime are directly adjacent to the array region. They have the sensor capability to detect what we detected. They almost certainly know it's there. Then why, Chin said slowly, were they so aggressively trying to keep us out of the corridor? The question landed and sat and nobody answered it for a moment. Then Director Cole, who had not spoken yet, said, because whoever is building that array told them to. Everyone looked at him. He was a compact, unremarkable-looking man of about 60, with the careful stillness of someone who spent a great deal of time thinking about things that other people didn't know existed. The facility I run has been monitoring anomalous communication signals for 9 years, he said. Signals in frequency ranges that no known species uses. Signals that have no matching pattern in any database. We've been trying to decode them for 7 years. We've made partial progress. He paused. 3 weeks ago we decrypted enough to extract a message. One message from a signal sequence that had repeated over 14 months. He looked at the table. The message was addressed to the Galactic Sovereignty High Command. And its content, in our best translation, was an instruction. Essentially, keep the young ones out of the corridor. We are not ready for them. The room was silent for a long time. Keep the young ones out of the corridor. We are not ready for them. We are the young ones, Yael said. Yes, Director Cole said. They know about us. Yes. And they're not ready for contact. Apparently not. Yael looked at the spatial map. At the array of gravitational anomalies distributed across 40 light-years of space. At the corridor that ran through the middle of it, directly between Earth and the rest of inhabited space. And the Sovereignty is doing what they're told, she said. It appears so, Vasquez said. Whatever this species is, they have enough influence over the Sovereignty to prompt this kind of protective action. The Third Armada showing up in the Vareth corridor wasn't about resource development. It was about keeping us away from that array. Away from the contact zone. Why? Yael asked. Why keep us away? If they're not ready for contact, the simplest solution is to not initiate contact. We weren't looking for them. We don't know, Director Cole said. We have one message. We don't have context. We don't have motivation. He paused. But the phrase "we are not ready for them" is interesting. Not they are not ready for us. Not the young ones are not ready. We are not ready for them. For humans. Another silence. They're afraid of us, Yael said slowly. Cole looked at her. That would be one interpretation. An unknown species, apparently capable of technology well beyond the Sovereignty's capabilities, has told the most powerful political entity in this galaxy to keep humanity away from their territory. She looked at the map. Because they're not ready for us. She was quiet for a moment. What does that tell you about what we look like from the outside? Nobody answered immediately. Then Admiral General Vasquez said quietly, It tells us that what we look like from the outside is not what we think we look like. Yael nodded slowly. No, she said. It's not. 12 days after the Luna base briefing, Yael was back in the captain's chair of the Eternal Resolve. The ship had been resupplied, some crew had rotated out and new crew had come aboard, and Rosa had used the time in port to run 3 full maintenance cycles and implement 17 modifications that she had been planning since before the Vareth corridor incident. The Eternal Resolve was, in Rosa's professional opinion, running better than she had ever run, which was already saying quite a lot. Their new orders were straightforward in language and complex in implication. Return to the Vareth corridor. Maintain treaty-compliant patrol posture. Make contact with the Sovereignty fleet if one is present. Communicate the following to the senior Sovereignty commander. Yael had read the communication twice. It was short. It was careful. And it was, she thought, exactly the right thing to say. They came out of FTL transit at the edge of the Vareth corridor at 0600 ship time. The Sovereignty fleet was there. Not 22 ships this time, 8. 4 Dominion-class frigates and 4 Veth-class patrol cruisers, arranged in a loose holding formation at the corridor entrance. A lighter presence. Still overwhelming force compared to the Eternal Resolve, but noticeably different from the Third Armada. And in command of the formation, as Yael discovered when she opened a hail, was not Admiral Kareth. It was Captain Liara, the Veth captain from the frigate Serene Dominion, the one who had identified Yael's strategy as making the situation boring. Commander Draven, said Liara, in the precise, musical cadence of Veth speech translated through the matrix. I was told to expect you. Captain Liara, Yael said. I didn't know you'd be leading this formation. After Admiral Kareth's report, the Sovereignty determined that this particular patrol station would benefit from a different approach. Pause. I volunteered. I found your previous communication style interesting. Thank you, Yael said, which was the appropriate response to a compliment from a Veth. Veth valued acknowledgement. I have something I need to tell you. Something I'm asked to share with the senior Sovereignty commander in this sector. That would be you at the moment. A slight pause. I'm listening. My government is aware of the gravitational array in the buffer zone beyond the Vareth corridor, Yael said. Silence on the channel. Not a short silence. A very long one. Commander Draven, Liara's voice was careful. Very careful. I'm not sure what you're. We found it 14 days ago, Yael said. Long-range spectral mapping. The anomalies are significant enough to register on sensitive equipment at 17 light-hours distance. She paused. We also have a partial decryption of the communication your government received from whoever built it. The silence this time was different. It was the silence of someone recalibrating everything. Captain, Yael said. I want to be clear about something. We are not here to exploit this information. We are not using it as leverage. We're not threatening to publicize it or to investigate the array without cooperation, or to take any unilateral action. My government has considered this situation carefully, and our position is this. Whoever built that array is apparently a civilization of significant power and sophistication, and they have communicated a preference for not yet making contact with humanity. We don't know their reasons. We don't know their intentions. But we think the appropriate response to that communication is to say, we received your message and we're open to dialogue about the terms of any eventual contact, on a timeline that works for everyone involved. She paused. And we'd like the sovereignty to help us send that message. Not to act on our behalf, you're not our representatives. But as a mutual communication channel. Because it's apparent that you're already in contact with this civilization, and we'd rather work with you than around you. The silence that followed was the longest yet. Then Captain Liara said very quietly in a voice that carried something Yael didn't expect, something that might have been relief, I will forward this to Sovereignty High Command immediately. But Commander, speaking personally not officially, I think you may have just made a very wise choice. Can I ask you something? Yael said. Off the record. Commander to Captain. You may ask. Were you told to keep us out of this corridor because of the array? A long pause. I was told to maintain a patrol presence in the corridor for purposes of operational security related to development zone activities in the Varith Prime system. But you know that's not the real reason. The silence was its own answer. Captain, Yael said gently. We're not the threat in this situation. Neither is the sovereignty. Neither, I think, are the builders of that array. But if everybody continues acting on the basis of incomplete information and unstated purposes, we're going to manufacture a conflict where there doesn't need to be one. She paused. I'm asking you to help us avoid that. Another long silence. Then, I will forward your message to High Command, Commander. And I will include a personal commendation for the quality of your communication approach. Pause. You are not what I expected. I get that a lot, Yael said. The response from Sovereignty High Command came in two forms. The first form was official, diplomatic, and arrived through Ambassador Chen Wei's channels in Geneva 23 days after Yael's conversation with Captain Liara. It was a formal acknowledgement that the sovereignty had received humanity's communication, that the sovereignty was prepared to explore the possibility of a tri-party dialogue framework that would include humanity, the sovereignty, and the civilization designated in the communication as the array builders, and that any such framework would be contingent on humanity's agreement to specific protocols regarding non-interference with the Varith buffer zone pending the completion of initial negotiations. It was, by diplomatic standards, a remarkably fast response. It was also a remarkable concession. The sovereignty had never previously acknowledged that any communication from humanity warranted a formal structural response at the high command level. Ambassador Chen read it twice and then called Admiral General Vasquez and said, in a voice that was carefully composed but cracked slightly at the edges, Ruth, I think they're taking us seriously. Good, Vasquez said. The second form of the response was less official and arrived through Captain Liara directly to the Eternal Resolve 6 days after the diplomatic communication, while Yael's ship was still on patrol rotation in the Varith corridor. It was a personal message from Grand Admiral Sova Reith, addressed to Commander Yael Draven by name. Commander Draven. I have read Admiral Caratha's account of the initial incident in this corridor, and subsequently reviewed your communications with Captain Liara. I am not in the habit of corresponding personally with commanders of junior rank from non-sovereignty species. I am doing so now because I believe it is warranted. In 900 years of military service, I have encountered many commanders who understood force. I have encountered fewer who understood the spaces between force. The moments where what you choose not to do is more consequential than what you do. You demonstrated that understanding in the initial standoff. You demonstrated it again in your communication with Captain Liara. I want you to understand something that will not appear in any official sovereignty communication to your government, because the political complexities are significant. The civilization that built the array in the buffer zone is not unknown to us. They have been known to us for 400 years. In that time, they have never communicated a preference regarding any developing species. They have never intervened in any sovereignty interaction with young civilizations. The message your facility decoded was the first time in 400 years they have directed the sovereignty to take any specific action. That action was about humanity. I do not know what humans look like from the perspective of a civilization that has existed for longer than the sovereignty. I do not know what they see when they observe your species that prompted the first communication they have sent in 4 centuries. But I am sufficiently experienced to recognize that it is significant. And I am sharing this with you informally and without official sanction, because I believe you have earned the information. And because I believe you will use it wisely. Whatever this situation becomes, Commander, I believe humanity's approach to it will matter enormously. Not because you have the power to determine the outcome, you do not alone. But because you have demonstrated something that I have not encountered in a young species before. You have demonstrated the ability to be more interested in understanding than in winning. That is rarer than fold space drives. Regards, Grand Admiral Sova Reith, Supreme Commander, Sovereignty Combined Forces. Yael read the message twice. Then she went to the ship's small observation deck, a semi-spherical room on the upper hull with a transparent ceiling that gave an unobstructed view of space, and she sat down on the floor, which was the only seating option given that the room was not really designed for sitting, and she looked at the stars. They didn't move. They never moved. But they were closer than they had been. She called her senior staff together in the briefing room and shared the message, all of it. Rosa and Marcus and Jimmy and Dr. Lena Shah sat around the table and read it in turn and were quiet afterward. 400 years, Marcus said. This civilization has been watching the sovereignty for 400 years and never reached out. And then we show up and suddenly they're sending messages. What does that mean? Jimmy asked. I don't know yet, Yael said. But I think we need to find out. Lena was looking at the part of the message about humanity being more interested in understanding than in winning. The Grand Admiral is telling us something about how they see us. About what made us significant to this other civilization. We're confusing, Rosa said. Everyone looked at her. She shrugged. I think that's what this is. We are confusing to them. We are small and we are young and we are technologically limited and we are in places we shouldn't be yet, and we are talking to admirals who could destroy us and asking for reference numbers and commenting on nebula colors, and we are building ships that look like tools instead of art because we care more about function than appearance, and we are modifying our fighters in ways they've never seen because we don't know what we're not supposed to try. She looked at Yael. We're confusing. We do not follow the pattern of what a developing species is supposed to look like. And something that has existed long enough to watch the sovereignty for 400 years. She paused. Something like that does not get confused easily. And when something confuses it, it pays attention. The briefing room was quiet for a moment. Rosa, Jimmy said, have I mentioned lately that you're terrifying? Frequently, Rosa said. Now, do we have a response to draft? We do, Yael said. Lena, work with Ambassador Chen's team on the official diplomatic response. Keep it aligned with the framework the sovereignty proposed. Cooperative. Non-threatening. Patient. She paused. And I'm going to write a personal response to Grand Admiral Reith. The personal response to Grand Admiral Reith took Yael 3 hours to write. It was not long. It was not elaborate. It said what it needed to say, which was, thank you for telling me. I understand the value of what you shared. Humanity will approach this with the respect it deserves. And then one more thing. The part she spent the most time on. The part that she drafted and deleted and drafted again and finally, at 2 a.m. ship time, sitting alone in her quarters with cold coffee and the stars visible through the small porthole above her desk, got right. Grand Admiral, you wrote that you don't know what humans look like from the perspective of a civilization 400 years older than yours. I want to offer a thought for whatever it's worth. I think we might look like a question. Not a threat. Not a wonder exactly. A question. The kind that arrives before you have an answer for it, before you've had time to prepare, and that sits there being genuinely impossible to ignore because questions that are asked by the universe don't go away just because you're not ready for them. We have been asking questions since we could think. About fire, about stars, about what's beyond the horizon, about who's out there and why and what does it mean. We are very young, as you noted, and technologically limited, as is also true. But we have never in our entire history been able to stop asking. I think whatever civilization built that array has been in space long enough to have stopped finding new questions. And then we showed up. And we are nothing but questions. I hope they find it as interesting as I find the stars. Respectfully, Commander Yael Draven, USS Eternal Resolve. She sent it at 0217 ship time. She went to sleep. She dreamed about Kansas. 31 days after Yael sent her personal message to Grand Admiral Reith, the array builders made contact. Not with the Sovereignty. Not through the diplomatic framework that humanity and the Sovereignty had been carefully constructing over weeks of formal exchange. Not through any channel that anyone had anticipated or prepared for. They made contact with the Eternal Resolve. Directly. Specifically. By name. Yael was in the middle of a routine systems review when every display on the bridge simultaneously lit up with the same signal, a frequency that matched none of the known communication bands used by any registered species, rendered through the translation matrix as a sequence of structured acoustic patterns that were recognizably language but were not any language in the matrix's database. The matrix worked on it for 40 seconds while everyone on the bridge sat very still and said nothing. Then the translation matrix resolved the signal into words, with a confidence rating of 71%, incomplete with significant gaps, but enough to extract meaning. The message was, Vessel Eternal Resolve. Commander Draven. We have read your message. The question you describe, we recognize it. We were not ready for it. We may not yet be entirely ready. But readiness is a different thing from willingness. We are willing. There is a point in the buffer zone. Coordinates to follow. In 14 days, 1 vessel. Yours. No weapons armed. We will do the same. We have watched your species for longer than your species has had writing. We have not spoken. There was not yet a need. There is now. Come. Bring your questions. The coordinates came through in a format that was immediately comprehensible to the Eternal Resolve's navigation systems. A point inside the buffer zone, in the space near the array, approximately 4 light-years from the Varith corridor. Yael looked at the message on her command display for a long time. Then she opened a channel to UNC Command. Admiral General Vasquez. We've made contact. You need to see this. The discussion at UNC Command and subsequently, an emergency joint session with Earth's Unified Political Council, lasted 6 days. The question of whether to go was answered in the first hour. Yes. Nobody seriously proposed not going. Humanity had not come all this way, built all these ships, pushed through all these barriers, to decline the first invitation from a civilization that had been watching them since before they had writing. The questions that took the remaining 5 days were the harder ones. Who goes? Under what terms? With what authority? What do they say? What do they offer? What do they ask? Yael was consulted extensively. She participated in briefings, strategy sessions, communication framework reviews, and one very strange session with a philosopher from Cambridge who had apparently been thinking about first contact scenarios for 30 years and who said, after listening to everything, that the most important thing humanity could bring to the meeting was genuine curiosity rather than the pretense of it, because any civilization old enough to have watched humanity since before writing would be able to tell the difference. Yael thought that was probably the most useful thing anyone said in 6 days of discussion. The final decision, the Eternal Resolve would go. Commander Draven would lead the contact. She would be accompanied by Dr. Lena Shah as diplomatic officer, Dr. Priya Nakamura as scientific advisor, and Ambassador Chinwei as political representative. The rest of the crew would remain on the ship. No weapons armed. Full communication equipment active. Recording everything. The Sovereignty was informed. Grand Admiral Reith sent a message that consisted of 4 words. Good luck, Commander Draven. Captain Liara sent a longer message. It ended, come back and tell us what they're like. We have wondered for 400 years. On the day before departure, Yael called her parents. Her mother was home from the hospital, doing well, rebuilding her speech with the determined patience of a woman who had spent 30 years teaching other people how to find the right words and was now applying those same methods to herself. Her father was home too because he had barely left since Margaret came home, in the quiet devoted way that was simply who he was. Tomorrow, Yael told them on the call. We leave tomorrow. Where? Her mother asked. Somewhere new, Yael said. Her mother looked at her through the screen for a moment. Her eyes were the same eyes that had read to Yael every night for her first 8 years of life, every story in a rotating library of favorites, until Yael had decided she wanted to read them herself and her mother had said, with the particular wisdom of a teacher, good, that's exactly right, that's what they're for. Be honest, her mother said, with the careful precision of reconstructed speech. Be kind. And listen more than you talk. You always said that, Yael said. I said it because it was always true. Margaret paused. Also, tell them, whoever they are, tell them about Kansas. Yael smiled. Why? Because, her mother said, everybody needs to know there is a place where the sky is big. It gives you the right feeling about things. Part 11, The meeting. The Eternal Resolve dropped out of FTL at the specified coordinates at 0600 ship time, 14 days after receiving the contact message. The buffer zone was not empty. There was a ship there. One ship as promised. And it was, the only word Yael had for it, sitting in her command chair looking at the main view screen, was old. Not visually aged, it was perfectly intact, with a surface that seemed to absorb and re-emit light in patterns that didn't quite match any physics Yael was familiar with. But old in the way ancient things were old. The way a mountain was old. The way the stars were old. With a quality of duration built into its very shape that was almost visible. It was larger than the Eternal Resolve. Considerably larger. Difficult to measure precisely because its surface seemed to resist the sensor array's attempts to return clean dimensional data. But not as large as Yael had half expected, not planet-sized, not incomprehensible in scale. Just very, very large and very, very still. No energy weapons readings, Marcus said from the sensor station, his voice quiet. No targeting signatures. Their propulsion is at standby. They are, he paused. They are exactly as they said they would be. Weapons down. Waiting. Same as us then, Yael said. Same as us. The communication channel opened without a hail. The array builders, they had not given their name yet in any communication, simply began transmitting, and the translation matrix worked at it with a confidence rating that climbed slowly as the matrix learned in real time from the new data streaming in. You came. We came, Yael said. We were not certain you would. The sovereignty did not come when they were new. They waited for us to come to them. That was 400 years ago. We went to them. We spoke briefly. We found that we were not ready for the interaction. Too much was assumed on both sides. Too many frameworks applied without examination. We withdrew. We have communicated with them since, infrequently on specific matters. We gave them the instruction regarding your species because we were concerned about a premature interaction under circumstances that would have been defined by force rather than choice. The Vareth Corridor incident, Yael said. Yes. If the sovereignty had engaged your vessel and destroyed it, the interaction between our civilizations would have begun as a story about human death. We did not want that story. We wanted a different beginning. Yael looked at the view screen. At the ship that was very old and very still. Why did you want a different beginning? She asked. You've watched us for, we think we know, but tell me. How long? Pause. Your species first used written symbols to record information approximately 5,400 of your years ago. We began observing you at approximately that time. We observed the writing appearing and found it interesting. We continued. 5,400 years. They had been watching since before the pyramids. Since before the wheel. Since before, almost everything. Why? Yael asked. Why did you keep watching? Because you were interesting. That's it. That is not a small thing. Pause. We have watched many species develop. We have watched more end than we find comfortable to recall, through their own action, through each other, through the indifference of the universe. Your species has a particular quality. You have nearly ended yourselves many times. Many times. The methods you invented to destroy yourselves were, frankly, alarming. You had the capability to render your world uninhabitable within a few centuries of developing significant technology. Many species achieve this capability. Most of them use it partially or completely. But we didn't, Yael said. You did not. You came very close, on multiple occasions, to paths from which recovery would have been impossible. And each time, not easily, not without enormous cost, not without suffering that we observed and found difficult to watch, you chose differently. Not because you were better than other species. We are not saying that. We are saying that you were stubborn. You refused to accept outcomes that other species accepted. You decided things could be different and then, sometimes very slowly, sometimes with enormous failures along the way, you made them different. That is not common. The bridge of the Eternal Resolve was completely silent. 12 human beings listening to a voice from a civilization older than their civilization's written memory, telling them who they were. We have been trying to explain to ourselves for 5,000 years, what you are. What you will become. We have models. We have projections. We have, if we are honest, been cautious, because the qualities that made you survive also make you difficult to predict. A species that refuses to accept outcomes, that invents solutions that did not exist before, that asks questions that have no established answers. A species like that is challenging to prepare for. So you built the array, Yael said. To buy time. To buy time for ourselves. Yes. We are not invulnerable. We are old, and old things can be fragile in ways that young things cannot always perceive. We did not know whether first contact with your species should happen while you were still growing, still making the errors of youth. We were considering. The message you sent, the question you described, it changed our consideration. What specifically? Dr. Lena Shah asked from her position beside Yael. You wrote that you think you might look like a question. That your species has never been able to stop asking. Pause. We have not been asked a question we did not already know the answer to in approximately 200 years. Your arrival, the message from your commander, was the first thing that has genuinely surprised us in a very long time. More silence. We find, the voice continued, that we missed being surprised. The conversation lasted 11 hours. 11 hours of questions and answers and careful navigation of concepts that didn't always have equivalent expressions in either language, even through the matrix. 11 hours of Ambassador Chinwei taking notes with the focused intensity of someone trying to capture a waterfall in a teacup. 11 hours of Dr. Priya Nakamura asking scientific questions that produced answers she kept having to write down because her brain couldn't hold them all at once. 11 hours of Dr. Lena Shah doing what she did better than anyone Yael had ever met, listening, really listening, and asking the follow-up question that opened the next door. And Yael sitting in the middle of it, asking and listening and thinking, and remembering what her mother had said, be honest. Be kind. Listen more than you talk. At the end of 11 hours, the array builders said something that Yael would remember for the rest of her life. We have a name. In your translation matrix, it will render approximately as, the oldest thread. We are aware this is somewhat dramatic. We did not choose it for drama. We chose it because it describes what we believe we are, not the strongest, not the wisest, but the one that has persisted through the most endings and beginnings. The thread that was there when others broke. We would like to continue this conversation. Not today. 11 of your hours is quite a great deal, and we need time to process what we have learned. We learn slowly now. Each does that. But we would like to return. And we would like to meet more of you. Not a ship, people. Individuals. We have watched your species at a distance for 5,000 years. We find ourselves curious about the particular. We find ourselves curious about you, Commander Draven. And about what Kansas looks like. Yael felt something she didn't have a name for, looking at the view screen at the old, still ship in the buffer zone dark. I'll bring photographs, she said. We look forward to them. The channel closed. The ship, the oldest thread ship, began to move, slowly and with the particular grace of something that had been moving through space for longer than humanity had existed, back toward the array. It paused. One last transmission. One sentence, rendered by the translation matrix at 94% confidence. Tell the sovereignty that the young ones may use the corridor freely. The time for caution has passed. Then they were gone. 6 months later. The Varith corridor was open. The sovereignty had formally withdrawn its patrol presence from the corridor in accordance with the oldest thread's message, and the diplomatic framework that humanity and the sovereignty had begun building in the wake of the first contact had grown into something that surprised everyone, including, possibly, the diplomats involved in building it. What had begun as a grudging accommodation of humanity's treaty rights had evolved, slowly and with significant friction but also with unmistakable momentum, into something that looked increasingly like a genuine partnership. Not equality, not yet, and honestly not for a long time. The gap in power and experience and technological capability was real and would take generations to close. But equality of standing was a different thing. And the sovereignty had begun, in small but measurable ways, to treat Earth as a partner with standing rather than a primitive species to be managed. The change had come from the top. Grand Admiral Sova Reith had written a formal strategic assessment paper, classified but leaked as strategic assessment papers inevitably were, that stated, in the measured language of 900 years of experience, that the sovereignty's historical policy of condescension toward developing species had been strategically counterproductive, and pointed specifically to the humanity case as evidence. The paper noted that humanity's unconventional problem-solving approach, its willingness to engage diplomatically under conditions of extreme disadvantage, and its successful initiation of first contact with a civilization the sovereignty had been unable to approach more deeply for 400 years all suggested that the sovereignty's framework for assessing developing species was flawed. It was, by sovereignty standards, a remarkable document. Captain Liara of the Serene Dominion had been promoted to admiral and assigned as the sovereignty's primary liaison to humanity's diplomatic mission. She and Ambassador Chinwei had dinner together, via holographic link, every second Thursday. Ambassador Chin reported that she asked a lot of questions about Earth food. Specifically, she had become deeply interested in the concept of barbecue, which she found philosophically fascinating. The Eternal Resolve was on patrol rotation near Vareth Prime when Yael received the news. She was promoted. Commander to Captain, a formal promotion with the full ceremony that her service record warranted, conducted on Luna Base in front of a hall full of people, with her mother and father in the front row. Margaret had traveled from Dodge City to the moon, which she had never done before, and which she described afterward as the most alarming and wonderful thing she had ever experienced. Robert had worn his best shirt and taken photographs of everything. Yael, standing at the podium in the dress uniform she kept forgetting she owned, gave a short speech that she had drafted and rewritten 9 times. She said what she meant, which was that she was grateful and that the people around her, her crew, her family, her species, were the reason any of this was possible. That none of what had happened in the Vareth corridor or the buffer zone or the 11-hour conversation had been about her. It had been about what humanity was: stubborn, curious, unwilling to accept an outcome it hadn't chosen, and constitutionally incapable of looking at an unknown thing without wanting to understand it. She said, "We are not the strongest species in this galaxy. We are not the oldest or the most advanced or the most feared. We are the most recently arrived, the most underpowered, the most likely to walk into a room we weren't invited into and ask the host to explain their artwork." She paused. And somehow, that turns out to be exactly what was needed. She got a standing ovation. She did not particularly expect it, and it made her feel a kind of warm, complicated embarrassment that she suspected she would never fully get used to. On the Eternal Resolve, the crew had watched the ceremony on the ship's main common area screen, crowded together, 4,000-odd people jammed into every available space, watching their commander stand at a podium on the moon and say something that was making half of them cry and the other half cheer, sometimes simultaneously. Jimmy Calloway was in the front of the crowd, because he had elbowed his way there through significantly larger people through a combination of determination and complete lack of social inhibition. He cheered loudly and without reservation and then turned to Marcus Webb, who was next to him with tears on his face that he was attempting to attribute to dust, and said, "I told you she'd be fine." "You didn't say anything," Marcus said. "I thought it. That doesn't count. In spirit it counts." Rosa Ortega was at the back of the crowd, against the wall, with her arms crossed and an expression on her face that was not crying in the specific, precise way that meant she absolutely was. 3 weeks after the promotion ceremony, Captain Yael Draven was sitting in the captain's chair of the Eternal Resolve. It was her chair now, more firmly and officially than it had ever been, with a fresh cup of coffee in her hand and the Vareth Nebula visible on the main view screen. It really was remarkable colors. "Marcus," she said. "Anything on sensors?" "Clean, Captain. The corridor is clear. No Sovereignty vessels within sensor range. The oldest threat array is running at approximately 15% output, down from 22% when we last scanned it. Drev thinks they might be winding it down. Maybe they don't need it anymore," Yael said. "Or they're preparing for something else," Marcus said. "Optimist." "Sorry?" "Force of habit." Yael drank her coffee. It was the right temperature. Whoever was responsible for this ongoing miracle of timing had never revealed themselves, and she had decided not to investigate because some things were better appreciated as mysteries. She looked at the nebula. At the colors, the deep blues and the warm ambers and the pale, impossible greens of ionized gases lit by distant suns,